This is Kenny Tan. Welcome to Real Estate License in 14 Weeks. This is episode 33 of Starting From Zero. Today we continue with chapter 9. If you like my video, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, hit the bell for future notification, and share this video with your friends. Agency disclosure, otherwise known as disclosure regarding agency relationship. There's a law in California that requires a real estate agent, whether you represent the seller or buyer, you're both required to give agency disclosure to both the buyer and the seller. So what is agency disclosure anyway? Agency disclosure is a form that contains all the legal obligations, disclosure regarding the legal obligations by an agent toward their own principal and also by an agent toward the other side, the third party. So first of all, what type of transactions are you required to give agency disclosure? Now, under the old law, only 1 to 4 unit residential property, but the law was changed in 2015. So if you read Felde's book talks about 1 to 4 residential property, and that has not been updated. So would you please take a note, update it to include all properties. 2015, before 2015, it's 1 to 4 residential. But after 2015, the law includes commercial properties as well. In fact, the law includes all properties. For any property for which you're a real estate agent, you are required to provide agency disclosure to your own principal, buyer, and then to the seller. If you represent the buyer, it doesn't matter. Next question is, who must comply? All real estate agents, both the broker and the broker associate. So usually, because the salesperson acts on behalf of the broker, is usually the salesperson who is required to give the disclosures. When to comply? Well, if you are a buyer's agent, now there is a name, a special term for buyer's agent. A buyer's agent is not buying agent. In the real estate industry, a buyer's agent is also known as a selling agent, so that's very confusing. So if you are not in the industry, you probably are not aware that a buyer's agent is what we call selling agent. A seller's agent is what we call listing agent. So you only have selling agent and listing agent, but no buying agent. So a selling agent represents the buyer. Okay, now that you have the terminologies right. So if you represent the buyer only, which means that you are the selling agent, the time to give the agency disclosure to a buyer is at the time he signs the offer. Now, in the industry, we have the whole package. When we have the offer, we also have the agency disclosure on top of the offer so that you will not forget to give the agency disclosure. Now, it is important that you give the agency disclosure at the time you present the offer for the buyer to sign, if you are the selling agent, meaning that you represent the buyer. Now, after the buyer signs, you also have to present the agency disclosure to the seller. Now, when do you present the agency disclosure to the seller? It's when you submit the offer to the buyer. So when you submit the offer to the buyer, the same form that has been signed by the buyer would also need to be signed by the seller to indicate that the seller has received your agency disclosure. So that's selling agent. Once when you submit the offer to the buyer for a buyer signature, once when you submit the signed offer by the buyer to the seller. Now, what about if you're the listing agent? If you're the listing agent, you must present the agency disclosure either at the time the listing agreement is signed or before the listing agreement is signed. Now, what happens if you forget you did not give an agency disclosure to the seller before he signs the listing? That is a void listing, meaning that if you don't do that, you could risk losing your commission. So what if you made a mistake? Let's say you have the seller sign the listing agreement without giving him the disclosure. You can correct the problem by canceling the first listing agreement for which there was no agency disclosure given to the seller and re-sign a new listing, but this time make sure that you have the agency disclosure be given to the seller before the listing is signed. Next, refusal to acknowledgement. What if you present the disclosure to either the buyer or the seller and they refuse to acknowledge? Refusal to acknowledge means that they will not put their signatures on the disclosure. Not a problem. In that case, you will simply record and explain and put it on a piece of paper and keep it for your record that they refuse to sign the agency disclosure. This really it rarely happens in the industry. Most buyer and seller will just simply comply and sign their signatures on the disclosure. That was general disclosure for agency. Let's talk about the specific disclosure. We've already talked about general disclosure. Now, specific disclosure talks about stating which side you represent. You can either represent the buyer only, or you can represent the seller only, or you represent both the seller and the buyer. No matter how many sides you represent, which side you represent, you are required to state those representations in the contract. While usually in the standard form, there's a place for the agents to indicate which side they represent. So that is the place where you want to make your specific disclosures. Let's talk about dual agency. There is one very important exam question regarding dual agency that you have to get the answer right. What is dual agency? Dual agency means you represent both the seller and the buyer. Okay, you represent both sides. That's what dual agency means. When you are a dual agent, there's one important law that you have to know. As a dual agent, you cannot disclose the bottom line of the buyer as well as the bottom line of the seller to each other. What does that mean? Let me give you an example. Let's say, for example, you listed a property for $500,000 and the seller told you that my bottom line is $480,000. And now you also represent the buyer. Buyer told you that his bottom line is $520,000. So you know the buyer is willing to pay $520,000. And you know the seller is willing to accept $480,000, but the listing price is $500,000. Well, in this case, the law says you cannot disclose to the seller that the buyer is willing to pay higher than the listing price. At the same time, you cannot disclose to the buyer that the seller is willing to accept lower than the listing price. So that is a very important exam question. Well, actually, there is one exception. The only time you can disclose this information is if you get the consent. So because sometimes the buyer may say, well, why don't you tell the seller that's my bottom line? In that case, it's okay. Or the seller may say to you that why don't you tell the buyer that's my bottom line? So as long as you have the consent, it's okay to tell. But if you don't have the consent of your principals, you cannot disclose the bottom line. What is an option? An option is a contract in which one party, the optionor, gives the other party, the optionee, the right to purchase real property or lease real property based on certain specified terms within specified time on actual consideration. In other words, it is a contract to keep an offer open. There are a few things you need to know about an option. An option must be with consideration, but the consideration, the threshold is really small. You only require 5 cents, a nickel, for the consideration. Also, an option must be in writing for it to be enforceable. I'll give you a scenario of an option. Let's say, for example, a developer is interested in investing in a vacant land. He approached the owner. He told the owner that he wants to have the option to purchase this property for 6 months. And the reason why he needs it for 6 months is so that he can conduct his investigation to find out if this property is suitable for him to invest. And that requires a lot of time. But for the owner, He does not want to have the property tied up for the developer without any compensation. So who is the optionor in this case? The optionor is the person who gives the option. So who gives the option? The owner gives the option. So who's the optionee? So the developer is the optionee because the developer receives the option. Usually on a deal like this, the developer will pay a certain amount of money to the owner to keep the property available to the developer and not anyone else within the next 6 months. So within the next 6 months, assuming that that's the option period, the owner cannot enter into any contract with another buyer. The owner cannot lease the property to anybody else. At the same time, the optionee, the developer, does not have the right to take possession of the property or use the property. Now, let's say, for example, the developer pays the owner $100,000 as consideration to keep the contract, to keep the offer open for the next 6 months. Let's say, for example, I'm a developer. I told the owner that I want to buy the property for $3 million. Okay, $3 million will be the future purchase price, assuming that at that time the developer is satisfied with the property and wants to pay the owner $3 million. However, the developer also pays the owner $100,000 as consideration for the option. The owner, the optionor, actually keeps the $100,000. So let's say 6 months later, the developer says, I don't want the property anymore. It's not suitable for me. The owner can keep the $100,000 because the $100,000 is consideration for the offer. This is the end of episode 33. See you next time.